Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
I didn't ask that of him, Mr Speaker, it must be said. My question is addressed to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister assure Australians that his ministerial standards have been and will be enforced?
The Prime Minister.
That is always the case, Mr Speaker. That is always the case. And I would hope that the same standards that are set out in this document would be adopted by the Leader of the Opposition in relation to his own front bench.
The member for Bass.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government's actions to address the important challenges facing our nation, both at home and abroad, are making us stronger and building a more secure future for all Australians?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bass. It was good to see the member for Bass in Tasmania on the weekend. It's wonderful to see Tasmania opening up again and the opportunities that are coming to Tasmania. But, Mr Speaker, whether in Tasmania or anywhere else around this country, this has been the most difficult year for so many Australians, for many the most difficult in their living memory. And throughout this time, our government has remained absolutely focused on the welfare of the Australian people and standing by the Australian people to ensure that we are delivering on the support that they need right here, right now, during the worst of the crisis, Mr Speaker, when it first hit back in the beginning of this year, and indeed into the future as well. And our priority is, as a government, obviously to address the health impacts of the COVID-19 global pandemic, some $18.5 billion of additional investment supporting our states and territories, but also directly investing in key areas such as mental health, hospital support and respiratory clinics and essential PPE and other equipment, Mr Speaker, but also to address the recovery plan required for the COVID-19 recession. And that, Mr Speaker, has included many measures. And JobKeeper at $101 billion, Mr Speaker, around $70 billion almost now has already been delivered, providing the lifeline that those businesses and those employees have needed during the worst of this crisis, and that extends out to the end of March. And today, Mr Speaker, we announced an additional $3 billion, more than that actually, to extend the COVID supplement, Mr Speaker, for the job seeker payment out till the end of March. Some additional more than $3 billion, some $3.2 billion, Mr Speaker, in additional support, not just into the economy, but recognising that we need to go through further transitions, and our economy is transitioning. We are moving through the gears again. The comeback has begun. Businesses are opening their doors again, and they are looking for workers, Mr Speaker. As I speak to my many members, and they relay the stories back from their own electorates of employers who are seeking people to come back into work, we need to connect those who found their way out of work because of the COVID-19 recession back into those jobs. And we will continue to support them through the JobMaker hiring credit and the many other measures that were contained in this year's budget to ensure that businesses will be able to invest and employ and bring forward the decisions that will enable our recovery to continue. But these aren't the only issues that we must remain focused on. The threats of counter-terrorism and the strategic challenges we faced in this region, Mr Speaker, have not gone anywhere, and we need to remain vigilant on all of those issues. We saw the terrible attacks in Austria, the terrible attacks in France, which we have deplored. And here in this country, we have not been diverted from the task of keeping Australians safe. We will continue, Mr Speaker.
Time has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is again addressed to the Prime Minister, and I ask, has the Prime Minister ruled out committing to net zero emissions by 2050 before the next election?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. Because, Mr Speaker, we would like to achieve, and we have an aspiration, Mr Speaker, that we would like to see this achieved. We have no issue, Mr Speaker, with being able to achieve at some point in the future, indeed, as we have already committed to under the Paris Accords in the second half of this century. That is actually a commitment as part of the accord, Mr Speaker. That is the same commitment that countries that have signed up to the Paris Accord have also committed to, Mr Speaker. Indeed, there are only 4 countries in the world today, only 4, who have committed through the formal process to the very exercise that the Leader of the Opposition has outlined. That is a formal process which has accountabilities attached to it. But I tell you what I'm not going to do, Mr Speaker. What I'm not going to do is make a commitment to the Australian people when I can't tell them the cost of it. When I can't tell them what it would mean for their jobs, for their incomes, for their livelihoods, Mr Speaker. I won't make such a reckless commitment as that, Mr Speaker. What I will do, what the Minister for Emissions Reduction will do, what my Cabinet and my government will do, is we will put in place the technology and the investment in the technology that is necessary to get us to the place that the Leader of the Opposition has referred to. And I know this, Mr Speaker, if you can't get there by technology, the only way to get there is by taxes, Mr Speaker. And that's why the Leader of the Opposition is so quick to commit, because the Leader of the Opposition and the Labor Party, they're not committed to getting there by technology, Mr Speaker. They are committed to getting there by taxes. And they will not, Mr Speaker. They will not be upfront with the Australian people, just as they were not at the last election when the former Leader of the Opposition could not explain the cost of their policies to the Australian people. And the Australian people smelt it, Mr Speaker. They smelt a rat on that, Mr Speaker, and they rejected the policies of the opposition because they could not come clean with the Australian people about what it meant for them. Now, Mr Speaker, we would like to achieve these goals. We think they're good goals. And we think we should be ensuring that we invest in the technology and working with countries around the world to achieve these goals. But they must be achieved by technological advancement that does not cost Australians jobs. Now, Mr Speaker, my members agree with this position. They agree strongly with this position, Mr Speaker, and the member for Hunter agrees with us as well, Mr Speaker. The member for Hunter has been driven out of the shadow cabinet, Mr Speaker, driven out by an ideological group of zealots, Mr Speaker, on that side of the House, who have no interest in the jobs of Australians in regional areas. That is the view of the member for Hunter. Come on board.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. The call goes to the government side. The member. The member for DAWSON.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy PM please inform the House how the Morrison-McCormack government is meeting the challenge of the pandemic recession through providing critical support to regional Australia? Is he aware of any alternative approaches and policies?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the free-ranging member for DAWSON, and he is free-ranging. And if the member for Hunter wants to come across this side, it's the Nationals you should come to, Joel, because we've got plenty of free-rangers on in our party. But I do welcome the member for Chifley to the shadow front bench, and I have messaged him. And I congratulate him. I'm not so sure they grow too much barley in Blacktown or wheat in Woodcroft or produce many sheep in Shanes Park or mining in Marsden Park. But
I just say to the Deputy Prime Minister, you're 30 seconds in. This is a long introduction.
And just wanted to make the point that the member for Hunter is welcome any time. And I do thank the member for DAWSON for his question. And he knows, and he represents a very diverse, very agriculturally and resource-rich area, but it's very diverse up there in North Queensland. And we see the abundant opportunities in this region, just like we see it right across the nation. And that's why we are backing local government areas, 537 of them, in Chifley, in Hunter, in DAWSON, with the local roads and community infrastructure projects. Indeed, to date we've approved $430 million for 2,300 projects under the now $1.5 billion local roads and community infrastructure program. Now, Burdekin, Mackay, Townsville, Whitsunday, all great regional local councils in the member for Dawson's electorate. Now, in Burdekinshire, they are utilising the $240,000 of this funding to improve the condition of Rita Island Road, resealing, rehabilitating the surface, a series of works which will support 10 full-time jobs. Mightn't mean that much to some of our metropolitan friends, but let me tell you, that is such That is such good delivery for a council such as that. And we're seeing it right across the nation, in urban areas, in small, rural, remote and regional areas, even the member for Barton's electorate. Indeed, we are making sure that those local councils get the funding that they need. Our recovery will not be Canberra-led. It will certainly not be Brisbane-led, but it will be through local engagement, local stakeholders, local people, local excavators on local sites. That's what we're doing. That's what we're doing through local government areas. Yes, you're right, member for Franklin, through local governments. And we're also, as part of our budget plan, a blueprint for the future, we are supporting essential social networks, social supports through the budget, increased mental health services. That's pretty important in regional areas, and I know it's pretty important in all electorates, but through also the JobKeeper plan. Now, Damien Connors, owner-operator of the Dispensary, a restaurant in downtown Mackay, had to lay off. He went from 70 staff to 20 overnight, but he's put half of those back on through the JobKeeper. That's local delivery. That's a good local small business. We're supporting.
The member for Barton.
Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. 1 million Australians are unemployed and 160,000 more are expected to join them by Christmas. There are 7 job seekers for every job available, and Australia is in the worst recession for nearly a century. Isn't this the worst possible time for the Prime Minister to cut the coronavirus supplement?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question. And it is indeed true that during the course of this COVID-19 recession, many Australians have found themselves in a situation they would never have imagined. They would never have imagined themselves having to be in touch with Services Australia to avail themselves of job seeker support. And that is why the government acted quickly to double the level of support during the worst part of this crisis, when their uncertainty levels would have been at the most extreme, when we would have had, and indeed did not have, any real indication of the severity of how difficult this would be. But we had to prepare for the worst of storms, and indeed we did. And we provided that support first. We said the safety net must be strengthened first, and that's exactly what we did. And we followed it up with measures like JobKeeper, and we followed it up with radically increasing the capacity, drawing public servants from all across, not just this place, but many other places, Mr Speaker, to ensure that we could process the unprecedented level of claims. And the work of Services Australia to ensure that support was provided to those Australians was absolutely outstanding, and I commend them again for their service here in this place today, which I'm sure all members would agree with me. But, Mr Speaker, as we come out of the COVID-19 recession, what's important under our recovery plan is you go through the gears up again, Mr Speaker. In the same way, we provided temporary and targeted support for those who needed it most. At the same time, as the economy improves, it's important that our safety net arrangements, Mr Speaker, do not negatively impact on how the labour market performs in this country, Mr Speaker, and provide potentially an impediment, as we hear from so many employers around the country who are seeking people to go into jobs. And those job advertisements, Mr Speaker, have doubled since May, and there will be more jobs coming as we open up, and it's important that's the case. It was essential to provide these emergency measures, but for Australia to move forward again, we can't remain, Mr Speaker, trapped by those emergency measures. We need to ensure that those emergency measures move with the recovery that is underway, and we are extending the job seeker payment at a cost of $3.2 billion to taxpayers around this country. The level of support provided by this government through the course of this pandemic, Mr Speaker, is unprecedented, and at a global comparison is one of the most significant of anywhere in the world. And I know that Australians have greatly appreciated that. They've greatly appreciated the context of it, the fact that it cannot be there at those levels forever, and that we need to graduate from those levels of support in order for our economy to recover again and get back to the strength that all Australians want it to be at. Now, Mr Speaker, these are sentiments that have also been expressed by the Leader of the Opposition and the Shadow Treasurer at the time that these measures were put in place.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded, and I call the Leader of the Greens. The Leader of the Greens, just wait for a second. Your microphone's not on. I just call the member Leader of the Greens.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to last night's Four Corners program and the revelations about toxic sexual culture in the Liberal Party, Minister's office and this parliament. Prime Minister, this is the parliament's Me Too moment, and women in this place and around the country want you to act. Will you immediately commence an investigation into what's going on in ministers' offices, stand aside the ministers involved with the Four Corners story while the investigation takes place, and put in place a proper framework for sexual misconduct to be reported and investigated so that every woman working in parliament feels confident that they can come forward without fear of reprisal?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for his question. The matters that were the subject of last night's report were matters that arose several years ago. They were not matters that were contemporaneous. They were matters that were raised several years ago. Did indeed, in fact, and predate my time as Prime Minister, and these matters were addressed by the then Prime Minister Turnbull, Mr Speaker, and his response, which I strongly supported, as members in this place will know at the time. He put in place a new standard for ministerial conduct in this place. He did so prospectively, Mr Speaker, and we have upheld that standard. And we will continue to uphold that standard for one very important reason, and it goes to the very issues that the member has raised. Every single person who works in this place, and any place in this country, should feel safe. And there should be, Mr Speaker, as there are in this place, as you will be aware, with the arrangements that are put in place for staff who work in this place to raise issues such as this through the Department of Finance, in an anonymous or in a very private and confidential way, Mr Speaker, and that is the process that is set down for all members of this place. But there is an even higher standard that was put in place by Prime Minister Turnbull and upheld by me to ensure that ministers go even beyond those arrangements. Now, Mr Speaker, I don't see, frankly, why the simple process of not saying it's okay for members of this place, ministers or shadow ministers or anyone else, leaders of political movements who are representing this party, should not be held to the same standards in terms of the conduct that you're referring to that are set out in the ministerial standards. It doesn't matter if you're a staffer in a shadow minister's office, a leader of the Greens office, in my office or any other member in this place's office. It doesn't matter. That sort of thing should not be on in this place. And under my government and under my predecessor's government, we made sure that those standards were put in place. And when we did it, some in this place, including on that side, mocked it. Some outside of this place, including in the media, mocked it as well. And they continue to with the language that they refer to that change in standards. And I decry that, Mr Speaker, because it's an important change in standards. And you can have it from me, Mr Speaker, that those standards in my government that are set out in that code will be upheld. And I would invite the Leader of the Greens and I invite the leaders of other political parties in this place to ensure that their staff have the same protection that staff in my minister's offices have.
Members on my left, the call goes to the government side, member for Hotham, and that is the member for BOWMAN.
Thank you, Speaker. My question to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer inform the House how the Morrison government's unprecedented economic support, including the Job Seeker Supplement and the JobMaker hiring credit, is meeting the challenge of the COVID-19 recession and providing real assistance to Australian families and helping businesses to create jobs?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for BOWMAN for his question and acknowledge his contribution to the medical profession before he came to this place and his deep commitment to improving Indigenous health and mental health.
Shortland.
Mr Speaker, the member for BOWMAN and others on this side of the House acknowledge the fact that there's been a once-in-a-century economic shock. An economic shock that saw 1.3 million of our fellow Australians either lose their jobs or saw their working hours reduced to zero at the start of the pandemic. In the June quarter, we saw GDP down by 7%, a record fall, Mr Speaker. But importantly, the economic recovery is now underway. 446,000 jobs have been created in the last 4 months. Consumer sentiment had its biggest increase in a budget month since the series first began back in 1974. Australia's AAA credit rating has been reaffirmed. Last week, the Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia said our fiscal strategy was the right fiscal strategy, Mr Speaker, and we were on the right track. And I can confirm to the House today that today consumer confidence is up for the 10th straight week, Mr Speaker, at an 8-month high, Mr Speaker. And business confidence is up by 9 points, up for trade, up for transport, up for construction and up for mining. Now, Mr Speaker, our measures that we have introduced have helped support that recovery. Measures that contribute around 26%, or the equivalent of 26% of GDP. JobKeeper, we have got $70 billion out the door, Mr Speaker. The cash flow boost, $32 billion out the door, Mr Speaker. The coronavirus supplement, $15.6 billion out the door, Mr Speaker. Two $750 payments to pensioners and carers, more than $9 billion out the door, Mr Speaker. And the one that they don't like to acknowledge, but we on this side of the House, allowing Australians to access their own super, more than $36 billion out the door, Mr Speaker, helping to support the economic recovery.
Members on my left.
Australians access to their own money. And today we took another step forward. Today we took another step forward by extending the JobSeeker coronavirus supplement at $150 out to the end of March at the cost of $3.2 billion. Another measure, Mr Speaker, which will help provide support to those who need it, Mr Speaker. Economic support to help get Australians back into jobs, economic support to help our economic recovery, economic support to help Australians right across the country to get through the biggest crisis in the last century.
Has concluded, and I call the member for Hotham.
Thank you, Speaker, and my question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister said today we cannot allow the lifeline that has been extended to now hold Australians back. Can the Prime Minister explain how supporting unemployed Australians during the worst recession in almost a century is holding the country back?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I will simply quote the member's own senior members in relation to these issues. It says the government needs to take into account
members on my left.
all sorts of considerations about the state of budget and the state of the economy. We expect the new job seeker rate will be lower than it is right now, Mr Speaker. That's what they've said. They've consistently said, Mr Speaker, that the level of the job seeker COVID supplement would be at its elevated levels and then it would be reduced. That was what the Leader of the Opposition and the Shadow Treasurer have said consistently, Mr Speaker, and that is what the government is doing. Mr Speaker, the member opposite would be aware that when you set these allowances, these rates, these welfare payments, if you set them at rates which can potentially impede the labour market from people moving into work as the economy strengthens, then that can prevent, Mr Speaker, the economy being able to get people into work. Now, our job, Mr Speaker, is to get people into jobs, not have them stay on welfare. Our plan is about getting businesses open. Our plan is about getting Australians into jobs and off welfare. That's why the job market hiring credit has been put in place in the budget, and it specifically goes to Australians who have been on JobSeeker and go into a job. Correct. A job that will support their incomes, not just with the support of the government, but with the support of a viable business that is part of the great Australian comeback and recovery that is underway as a result, Mr Speaker, of the tremendous resilience of Australians, but also of the strong policy settings and economic supports that were put in place by this government. Now, Mr Speaker, those who need the support will continue to receive it, and we have extended the JobSeeker coronavirus supplement out till the end of March at a cost of $3.2 billion. But Australians have always known, as we went into these most difficult times, that the elevated support that was necessary during these times of crisis is not sustainable on an ongoing basis, Mr Speaker. And they understand that we need to re-gear the economy as we move through to the recovery and we return our economy to the strength that it was before. Now, you don't achieve that by weighing it down, Mr Speaker. You do it by freeing it up. And our policies are about freeing up businesses to employ more Australians. Mr Speaker, it may come as a surprise to the member opposite, but all across regional Australia at the moment, Mr Speaker, there are farmers and orchardists and others who are crying out for people to come and work on their fields and to realise that harvest. And it was our government, Mr Speaker, that put in place a $6,000 relocation allowance that could say to Australians who are in need of that work—
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. I call the member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Will the minister update the House on how the Morrison government is addressing the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic through its advancement of potential vaccines?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Higgins, both for her question but in particular for her work as a doctor and as a leading medical researcher. And as she well knows and as the House well knows, the pandemic continues to rage around the world. In the course of the last week, extraordinarily, more than 3.5 million cases were diagnosed. The world is almost at 51 million cases. What that means, of course, is that more lives will be lost, and more lives are being lost than ever before. We've seen 50,000 lives lost in those same 7 days. 50,000 lives lost. We are now at over 1.26 million lives lost officially, and inevitably the real total is far greater. Against that background, I'm privileged to be able to inform the House that Australia has had a third successive day of zero cases of community transmission Australia-wide. And all Australians should be congratulated for that. All Australians have played their part, and I want to thank and honour them for that work. But the work is not done. We know that we're making great progress in our hospitals. The advice from the National Incident Centre is that not only is it 3 consecutive days with zero cases, but this is the first time since the 27th, 28th and 29th of February that we've had 3 consecutive days with zero cases. We now have 0 Australians in ICU and 0 on ventilation as a result of COVID-19. But with the numbers around the world as they are, our work with vaccines is more important than ever before. We've completed the contracts for 4 different vaccines. Yesterday we referred to the fact that commencement of manufacturing had begun in Victoria for the AstraZeneca vaccine. Today I'm privileged to be able to inform the House that in relation to the Pfizer vaccine, the information internationally is very positive. There's more work to be done. We need more data to be absolutely certain, but after discussions with the CEO of Pfizer Australia, Anne Harris, this morning, I am more hopeful and more confident than ever. What we see is a putative effective rate of 90% for this vaccine, where the hope had been 50%. So a 90% effectiveness rate on the data available so far hasn't just lifted hopes and opportunities here in Australia, it lifts hopes and opportunities for the world. What we have done with vaccines is to build a portfolio of vaccines, a pipeline of 135 million units. We are fortunate to have made the right choices. We are fortunate to be part of this, and ultimately we are saving lives and protecting lives.
The member for Corangamite.
My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is cutting the coronavirus supplement for about 7,000 Australians on JobSeeker in my electorate of Corangamite. Why did the Prime Minister say we cannot allow the lifeline that has been extended to now hold Australia back? Doesn't he realise people want to work, but there simply aren't enough jobs in the middle of the worst recession in almost a century?
The Treasurer.
Well, I thank the honourable member for her question, but I can inform her that what we have done today is extend the job seeker coronavirus supplement, Mr Speaker, at a cost of $3.2 billion. And I'd say to the honourable member, if you look in the budget papers announced on October the 6th, there wasn't an extension of the job seeker coronavirus supplement from January to March. But it wasn't. But today we have announced an extension at $3.2 billion, Mr Speaker, at $150. And the reason why we are tapering down these payments of JobKeeper and JobSeeker is because the Australian economy is recovering, Mr Speaker. And the honourable member may be interested to know that at the peak of this pandemic, the effective unemployment across this country was 15%. Now, right now, today, it's 9.4%, Mr Speaker. But if you take out Victoria, where we've seen the terrible impacts of the second wave, the effective unemployment rate in Australia would be about 7.8%, Mr Speaker. So what we have done is provide an extension of an extra 6 months for JobKeeper and an extension now for JobSeeker. But, Mr Speaker, I would just say to the honourable member that if she listened to the Leader of the Opposition when he was asked directly the question by Carl Stefanovic on the Today Show, so how do you start to balance the books if you want to extend JobKeeper and extend those increases to JobSeeker? And the Leader of the Opposition replied, well, we haven't said to extend it, Mr Speaker. What we have said, though, is it will need a tapering off. Now, Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition has said it's needed a tapering. We have undertaken a tapering, and it's in the best interest of Australian jobs.
The member for Sturt.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. Will the minister update the House on how Australia's approach to the development and deployment of new energy technologies will help meet the challenges posed by rising global emissions? Is the minister aware of any alternate approaches?
The Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Sturt for his question and for his passionate focus on the role of energy technologies. And it was a pleasure recently, earlier this year, to visit the Australian Hydrogen Centre in Adelaide, where they're feeding hydrogen into the pipelines down in South Australia. What a great project. Now, like all of us on this side of the House, he knows that the secret, the way to reduce emissions whilst we keep a strong economy, drive investment, drive jobs, as we bring down emissions, is to ensure that we deploy and develop technologies that are going to achieve those outcomes, Mr Speaker. And that's why we've developed our technology investment roadmap, which is all about focusing on those technologies where Australia has competitive advantage, where we can bring down emissions here in Australia and around the world, Mr Speaker. And we know on this side, if it's not to be technology, it is to be taxes, Mr Speaker. It's a choice. Now, one of the technologies that we're focused on is carbon capture and storage. 59 carbon capture and storage projects around the world, Mr Speaker, the biggest of which is here in Australia, almost half of which are in the United States. And I note that President-elect Biden has recently said, and I quote, that he will double down on carbon capture and storage, Mr Speaker. Double down. Continue to invest and provide incentives for carbon capture and storage in the United States. But alongside carbon capture and storage, there's soil carbon, stored energy, low-emission steel and aluminium, Mr Speaker, and, of course, hydrogen that I mentioned earlier, Mr Speaker. It is about choice. It's about technology versus taxes. Now, Mr Speaker, today the member for Hunter made his choice. He made his choice, Mr Speaker. He called time. He doubled down. He called time on the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker, and he confirmed what we all feared on this side of the House, that the Labor Party has walked away from those hard-working Australians that they used to support. They've walked away from their blue-collar base, Mr Speaker. And the member for Hunter said today, how did it all go so terribly wrong? How did it all go so terribly wrong? Well, Mr Speaker, 4 words, the member for Hindmarsh. But it gets worse, Mr Speaker. Worse than this. After 14 years of trying, we hear from the member for Hunter, after 14 years of trying, the Labor Party has made not one contribution to the reduction of greenhouse gases in this country. Not one contribution, Mr Speaker. We're meeting and beating our targets. We met and beat Kyoto, Mr Speaker. It's time for others to stand up and join the member for Hunter to stand up for hard-working Australians, because that's what we do on this side of the House every day.
Members on both sides. The member for Lyons.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is cutting the coronavirus supplement for more than 7,500 Australians on JobSeeker in my electorate of Lyons. Why did the Prime Minister say we cannot allow the lifeline that has been extended to now hold Australia back? Doesn't he realise that in Tasmania people want to work, but there simply are not enough jobs?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Lyons for his question. And I was in Tasmania on the weekend, Mr Speaker, and I was pleased to see how the recovery has begun and the comeback in Tasmania is underway. And as that economy starts to move forward, and Mr Speaker, particularly in Tasmania, they raised two particular issues with me. One was they are needing more workers in Tasmania, and they need more workers not just in the tourism and the hospitality sector, but they particularly need those additional workers in the regional parts of the country where they every year struggle to get those workers to work on the orchards and the other critical industries that drive the Tasmanian economy. Now, that is normally done with a great deal of assistance of the backpacker market, Mr Speaker, that comes in and supports those industries. But under COVID, there is a real problem as a result of not being able to access those workers. And that's why the government put in place a $6,000 relocation allowance to ensure whether they may be people who are living in the members' electorate further down south towards Hobart who may wish to go and travel to another part of Tasmania and take up those jobs. There's $6,000 there to support them. Mr Speaker, our response to the COVID-19 recession is not to have policies that keep people on welfare, but to have policies that get them into jobs and support the businesses and the investments that they want to make, and in particular the job hiring credit, which is going through this place this week, Mr Speaker. A job hiring credit which is about getting people who have been on job seeker payments and to put them into jobs, Mr Speaker, because the best form of income support anyone can have is a job in the real economy, and that's where we see the future. And we may differ. We may differ from the Labor Party about that. They may see the future under COVID-19 of Australia being weighed down, Mr Speaker, but we're not going to be, and Australians won't be. Businesses are wanting to invest again. Businesses are wanting to move forward again. Businesses are wanting to hire again, and we'll be supporting them in that exercise, because whether it's in Tasmania, whether it's in the Northern Territory, whether it's in Western Australia, Victoria or anywhere else, Mr Speaker, we know Australians want to work, and we're going to continue to ensure that they get every opportunity to do so.
The member for MONCRIEFF.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison government is keeping Australians safe by meeting the challenges posed by the scourge of terrorism, including domestic terrorism?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for her question, for her very keen interest in making sure that the Gold Coast remains a safe community for people to visit and to live in. And, Mr Speaker, this government is absolutely determined to make sure that we can keep Australians safe. And we work every day with our agencies to make sure that we can deal with the threat of terrorism. And as the Prime Minister mentioned earlier, all of us in this place condemn the terrible tragedies that took place in France and Austria, and we extend our deepest sympathies to those families and those victims of those heinous attacks. Mr Speaker, as we know, the threat not only is extant in Europe and right across the Western world, but of course in our own country, and the threat level currently is at probable in our country, and it's worth always reminding ourselves that this is an ever-existing threat. Terrorists haven't gone away because of COVID, and the threat remains in our country as much as it does elsewhere around the world. We know that since September 2014, when the national terrorism threat level was raised, there has been 7 attacks and 18 major disruption operations in response to imminent attacks that were being planned on Australians. 116 people have been charged as a result of counter-terrorism operations, and right now there are 22 people currently before the courts for terrorism-related offences. Yesterday, a 56-year-old male faced court following an investigation into a stockpile of illegal firearms and explosives by the Queensland Joint Counter-Terrorism Team. I want to pay tribute to all of those officers who were involved in that operation, and we've supported those officers and police officers and intelligence officers right across the country by the fact that we have introduced and passed 20 tranches of legislation since 2014. We have made it an absolute priority, Mr Speaker, of this government to protect Australians, to deal with that threat, and that work continues. I want to congratulate ASIO for the work that they have undertaken, the way in which they've engaged with the business community, the way in which they have provided advice in a very sober way to Australians to allow people to understand the threat. The work of ASIO officers, the work of the Australian Federal Police officers has been bolstered significantly by this most recent budget, but by more than $2.3 billion since August of 2014. We've managed the budget well. We've made tough decisions over recent years to make sure that our budget is in a very strong position, not just to deal with COVID, but to make sure that our agencies can be properly resourced so that those police officers, those intelligence officers on the front line can continue to do their work. They work 24/7, spend a long time away from their families to keep us and our families safe, and we really honour and thank them for the work that they continue to do.
The member for Dunkley.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is cutting the coronavirus supplement for nearly 9,500 Australians on JobSeeker in my electorate of Dunkley. Why did the Prime Minister say we cannot allow the lifeline that has been extended to now hold Australia back? Doesn't he realise people want to work and they need this lifeline to continue during the worst recession in nearly a century?
The Treasurer.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I say to the member for Dunkley that we've actually extended JobSeeker at a cost of $3.2 billion, providing an additional $150 through the supplement out till the end of March, Mr Speaker. And the reason why we've done this is because we recognise there are people in need, but at the same time the Australian economy is recovering from the once-in-a-century economic shock, Mr Speaker. 1.3 million Australians either lost their jobs or saw their working hours reduced to zero at the start of the crisis. 60% of those are now back in work, and 60% of those are women and 40% are young people of those jobs that have been created, Mr Speaker. And we also know that the effective unemployment rate, which got as high as 15%, has now come down to 9.4%, Mr Speaker, but for Victoria it would be at 7.8%. We also know that the job ads have recovered 3/4 of their fall since the start of this pandemic. We also know that both Treasury and the RBA have updated their labour market forecasts. Originally they were expecting unemployment to peak at around 10% by the end of this year. Now they're saying at around 8%, Mr Speaker. So the fact that 446,000 jobs have been created in the last 4 months shows that the economic recovery is underway. But when it comes to tapering both JobKeeper and JobSeeker, I'd say to the honourable member, don't just listen to the words of her leader, Mr Speaker, also listen to the words of the Shadow Treasurer, who's still yet to ask a question, Mr Speaker. Now, the Shadow Treasurer was asked on the ABC, when Labor talks about wanting to see these programs tapered, how long would that be tapering for? And then the member for Rankin says the government should be looking at this kind of tapering, Mr Speaker. And then the member for Corio, the deputy leader, turned up on Sky, Mr Speaker, and said there needs to be an appropriate tapering of the government's support, Mr Speaker. The tapering, the removal of the government's support is done at a slow enough pace that enables the private sector to bounce back, and that's what we're suggesting, Mr Speaker. And today we've talked about how consumer confidence and business confidence is up, Mr Speaker, and how the jobs are coming back. So those on the other side should stop playing politics and start focusing on the substance of this policy, which is the extension of the JobSeeker payment for another 3 months, supporting Australian jobs and supporting the Australian economy at a cost of $3.2 billion.
The member for Reid.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Defence. Will the Minister inform the House how the Morrison government is working with our partners in the Indo-Pacific to meet Australia's national security challenges?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for her question, for her strong support of the Australian Defence Force. We have, Mr Speaker, made a massive investment into our defence men and women, and we will continue to do so because we not only want to keep Australians safe, but we want to keep people safe and protected in our own region. Mr Speaker, we know that the Indo-Pacific is in the midst of the most consequential strategic realignment since the Second World War, and Australia stands very firmly with our partners in this region. We want to make sure that we have a free, open and prosperous Indo-Pacific. Australia will never ever compromise on our values, and our partners know that. We will continue to work very closely with family, as the Prime Minister often describes our near neighbours. We want to make sure that we can provide support to them not only in the response to COVID, but to make sure that over the coming years and decades we can work very closely with those partners to secure our region. Mr Speaker, the Defence Minister, Minister Reynolds, has recently met with her counterparts from Japan, from Singapore, Brunei and the Philippines to discuss challenges and opportunities for our bilateral partnerships, and these are very important partnerships in terms of our response in this region. Australia, as many Australians will know, is currently taking part in Exercise Malabar for the first time since 2007. It is an absolute milestone opportunity to enhance Australia's maritime capabilities and to build our interoperability with major regional democracies. Last week, Mr Speaker, HMAS Ballarat joined our close partners, the US Navy, the Indian Navy and the Japan Maritime Self-Defence Force, for the Malabar naval exercises. Australia accepted India's invitation to take part, building on the positive momentum of our recent comprehensive strategic partnership. It is through these strong regional partnerships that we can ensure our region continues to be secure and prosperous, and both large and small nations have their sovereignty respected. I do want to pay particular tribute to the men and women of the Australian Defence Force for their tireless work. They do us incredibly proud. They work here, they work across the world, and as I made my remarks in relation to the men and women of ASIO and the Australian Federal Police, similarly, in the Australian Defence Forces, these men and women work away for many months of the year with their comrades to protect our interests, and we should recognise that their families, Mr Speaker, miss them during that absence, but they know and they're incredibly proud. And as we go to schools in our electorates and speak to the kids whose mums and dads are deployed, we know how incredibly proud they are of the work that they do in our country's name, and we honour their service again today.
The member for Dunkley.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Government Services. Can the Minister inform the House why he still plans to close the Mornington Centrelink shopfront in March 2021 when the site received over 31,000 contacts in the 2019-20 financial year?
The Minister for Government Services.
Thank the member for her question. As the House would know, Services Australia runs an extraordinarily diverse property portfolio. In fact, 728,000 square metres Services Australia runs. 402 commercial properties. Services Australia runs 325 customer-facing sites. It's a large portfolio. Now, that portfolio used to be larger. In fact, it used to be 256 sites larger, which were those that Labor cut from 2009 to 2013. In fact, in 2009, 61 sites were cut. 2011-12 budget, 67 sites were cut. So I say to the member, your Tactics Committee has given you the hospital pass from hell when you walk in here and talk to us about sites, when the colleagues of yours over there closed 200
Minister will resume his seat. The member for Dunkley on a point of order.
Point of order, Speaker. Relevance. The question was very direct. Can the minister inform the House why he plans to close a Mornington Centrelink shop in March 2021, given the number of contacts?
Okay, and I just say to both the member and the minister is entitled to give some context, but I judge that he's done that, and the question was very specific.
Mr Speaker, the Mornington Service Centre has been extended and the extent of the lease is up to the date the member had. Now, clearly, as we move forward towards that date, we have conversations with our leaseholders as we do. It's important to also understand that in terms of leaseholders, we have 354 individual landlords that the department engages with across our 402 commercial sites, and we continue to engage with them as necessary. But in terms of service delivery, it's important the member understands that the service delivery to her constituents will continue. For example, it's important the member understands that yesterday Services Australia answered 147,000 calls, and on the Social Services and Welfare line those calls were answered in 67 seconds on an average speed of answer. I'd say to the member, in 2013 the average speed of answer across Social Services and Welfare under those officers was 90 minutes. 90 minutes! Australians waited for 90 minutes. Yesterday they waited 67 seconds. That's the difference. Now, I'd say to the House, unfortunately this financial year, 47 Australians haven't been able to get through on the call centre. Compared to when the member for Sydney was there, it was 40 million calls were not answered in the 12 months the member for Sydney was there. So I'd say to those officers, if we're going to have a discussion about service delivery standards, we will stand up every day and compare our 67 seconds to 90 minutes. We'll compare our 47 Australians who couldn't get through in our lines compared to 40 million. We'll compare 256 closures over there compared to limited here.
I call the member for Curtin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Communications, Cyber Safety and the Arts. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is keeping Australians safe online by meeting the challenge posed by the increase in online activity during the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Minister for Communications, Cyber Safety and the Arts.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I do thank the member for Curtin, who, of course, in her previous role as Vice-Chancellor of the University of Notre Dame, Australia, was a very strong champion of the education of and, of course, the safety of younger Australians. And so this is an area in which she has a considerable interest. How do we keep Australians of all ages, but certainly including younger Australians, safe online? And as the member has rightly noted, during COVID we saw an extraordinary increase in the amount of activity occurring online around Australia and indeed around the world. In fact, the National Broadband Network saw an increase in daytime network traffic of up to 70%. So the internet is a very important place where Australians come together to engage, to do business, to socialise, to be informed. And we welcome more activity on the internet, but we also need to recognise that, as in all forms of human interaction, when people come together, there will be a percentage of times where the interactions are not as we would wish. And that's why it's so important that we have the E-Safety Commissioner there, an initiative of our government in 2015, that we have the E-Safety Commissioner there to support Australians in staying safe online. We've seen a surge in reporting to the E-Safety Commissioner over the March to September period, a 49% increase in adult cyber abuse, a 32% increase in youth cyberbullying, a 123% increase in illegal and harmful content. Now, we are making sure that the E-Safety Commissioner has the resources to help keep Australians safe online. This year's budget provides a $39.4 million over 3 years for the E-Safety Commissioner, which builds on the $11.9 million over 3 years we provided to the Be Connected program to help older Australians get online and stay safe online, and a $10 million funding boost we provided in June 2020 to support the E-Safety Commissioner in dealing with the increase in workload as a consequence of COVID. So in total, the Morrison government investing over $100 million over the next 3 years to help keep Australians safe online through the work of our world-leading e-Safety Commissioner. And we are also committed and well advanced towards introducing a new Online Safety Act that will give the e-Safety Commissioner expanded powers. It will reduce the required takedown times from the digital platforms from 48 hours to 24 hours. There will be a new adult cyber abuse scheme. We will introduce what are called the basic online safety expectations to make it very clear to the digital platforms what the Australian community and the Australian government expects of them in keeping Australians safe online, and the e-Safety Commissioner and her office will keep providing practical tools and tips for Australians to stay safe online. esafety.gov.au. Australians deserve to stay safe wherever they are, including online.
And I call the member for Maribyrnong.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Government Services. Will the Minister please explain why 600 jobs of staff of up to 2 years' experience were axed at the end of October across multiple Centrelink application processing sites in Middle Park, in Dandenong and in Sydney, at a time when more Australians than ever before are struggling to find work?
The Minister for Government Services.
The member for his question. I'd say to colleagues in the House, when COVID-19 was running rampant in March, Services Australia expanded its staffing by 14,800 people. That's the amount we mobilised. 3,000 came from within Services Australia, over 3,000 from other government departments, including security guards in this place here, went into a processing centre up in one of the alcove areas to process Australians. 8,000 extra staff were employed in from our external agencies to assist us. And as we've responded to the pandemic, including processing over 1 million claims in 55 days, an amount we'd normally do in 2 years, the staffing levels are coming down. So we used our service delivery partners to surge staff up for when the crisis was in place and to surge staff down. Luckily, the Finance Minister is not in this House because we are still about 300 staff over ASL as we've come down. Now, like a tale of two cities, we should compare the Morrison government's response to this pandemic to how Labor responded to the GFC, because from 2009 to 2013, Labor cut staff by 4,800. 4,800 staff over there were cut in response to the GFC, compared to a plus 300 today. That's the tale of two responses. So this side will not have a bar of the member for Maribyrnong coming in and saying that as we surge contract staff up, that we shouldn't be surging them down as the requirement for processing has come down, when those in response to the GFC, 4,800 ASL permanent public servants were cut. And at the same time, if you look at the processing of where we are now, right now Services Australia has on hand job seeker applications that are actionable, 36,000, which is just shy of 2 days' worth. Just 2 days' worth of processing actionable claims on hand. That's what we've got. So I say to the member for Maribyrnong, 1,046 ASL cut in 2010-2011 budget. Oh, that's a member for McMahon. That's awkward. 1,000 permanent public servants cut on that member's watch. Where's the member for Gorton? This is always a surprise for us, isn't it? The member for Gorton, 2,381 average staffing level permanent public servants cut in the 2011-12
just say to the Minister,
that's what the members cut. This side can be proud of what we've done.
The member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for the Environment. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is meeting Australia's environmental protection challenges, including through initiatives to address plastic waste in our oceans?
The Minister for the Environment.
Thank
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Robertson for her question? Whether it be the shocking spectacle of marine turtles tangled in discarded nets or seabirds ingesting pieces of brightly coloured balloons because they look like food, or the microplastic that we cannot even see entering the food chain, this recycling week is a reminder of one of the most pressing issues facing our environment, that of plastic debris in our oceans. And the Morrison government's commitment to tackling this problem comes in three key approaches: major policy reform, our waste export ban that gives value to the plastic you throw away, turns it into something that is recycled, reused, remanufactured, and innovative new approaches are starting to do that behind the Prime Minister's waste export ban. Secondly, we're creating international partnerships, such as those in the Pacific, where we're recognised as leaders on blue carbon, marine park management and everything to do with keeping our fishing activities sustainable. And thirdly, and I visited the member for Robertson's Clean Foreshore activities in her electorate of quite some time ago, where we met the amazing Jono Johnston and his barge and the school children actually picking up huge volumes of plastic that are in the waterways. Those practical activities contribute enormously, Mr Speaker. Here at home, we're cleaning up the Yarra, the Torrens, the Brisbane, the Swan and the Hawkesbury rivers. We're partnering with conservation volunteers and Clean Up Australia to reduce the litter on our beaches and the litter in our waterways. We're partnering with our Pacific neighbours, and I recognise the Minister for the Pacific and the Foreign Minister in the other place. 310,000 tonnes of plastic waste generated every year through our Pacific Ocean Litter Project. We're cleaning that up. In our own oceans, this year's budget included new funding to get rid of those ghost nets in the waters of Northern Australia with a $14 million commitment, funding new technologies to track and map this discarded fishing gear, but also providing Indigenous ranger groups employment opportunities to retrieve and recycle waste. These measures are on top of the $1.9 billion over a decade for the Great Barrier Reef to implement the Reef 2050 plan, funding that manages crown of thorns starfish, reduces marine debris and implements an ambitious world-leading marine restoration program. Mr Speaker, there's our Antarctic science, the role our meteorologists and scientists play in southern ocean climate systems, in the impact of krill and plastics, and that research is shared internationally and every Australian should be incredibly proud of it. I've spoken in the House about how we are driving a $1 billion transformation of our waste and recycling industry. The plastic that we recycle doesn't get into our oceans, and the work that we're doing internationally and at home is practical and on the ground, and it makes a difference.
The member for Maribyrnong.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Minister for Government Services. Why does the Morrison government continue to merge and close Centrelink shopfronts right around Australia when data shows that this slashing and cutting has led to a 30% increase in wait times for Australians visiting Centrelink seeking assistance?
The Minister has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. He's the gift that just keeps on giving, isn't he? What part of those opposite closing 256 service centres from 2009?
I just say to the Minister, just the Minister can pause for a second. I was endeavouring to pull him up in the last answer. This was a very specific question. He can compare and contrast, but let me be blunt, he can't just start with the contrast. He's actually got to address the question. The Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. For the benefit of the House, prior to COVID-19, an average of 69,000 Australians would visit a service centre, a Centrelink, over 325 every day. That number now varies between 29,000 and 35,000. And it varies like that because if you actually call a call centre now, you're answered in 67 seconds. Prior to COVID-19 last year,
Members on my left.
560,000 Australians logged into our digital channels every day. Today it's an average of 2.6 million and all major payments are online. So the number of channels that Australians can go to is now wide, it's varied and they are efficient. So the 35,000 Australians that are now going into the 325 Centrelinks each day have the opportunity to receive.
The member for Maribyrnong will resume his seat. The member for Maribyrnong on a point of order.
Just a point of order on relevance. My question was very specific, and perhaps the minister may never need to visit a Centrelink office, but why have the waiting times for people who have visited? The minister's answering about digital, but what about the people who actually have to visit Centrelink? Why has the waiting time increased?
The minister has the call, and as I said, it was a specific question.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Because there's now half the Australians going to our service centres because they can access digital and telephony channels, there is now the opportunity for our service delivery personnel to spend more time with more complex service centre service delivery cases. Because the vast majority of Australians who are updating income, updating assets, updating their work they've done can do it online, it means more needy Australians and Australians with complex cases are now able to have more time spent with them in service delivery. And the numbers show that we are now providing Australians with more complex cases a higher level of service delivery at our shop fronts. And what is interesting is, remember, the number of staff in our service delivery is still 300 over ASL. There's still 325 service centres. There's still the same number of staff there. They are providing a greater level of care for complex cases to Australians. And when you compare that to 4,800 staff cuts from those opposite and 256 service centres closed, the contrast between service delivery and the dignity to which Australians have been served during this pandemic compared to those opposite in the GFC could not be starker.
The member for Mallee.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture, Drought and Emergency Services. Will the minister outline to the House how the Morrison-McCormack government is responding to the challenges posed by climate change for regional Australia and building resilience to natural disasters?
The Minister for Agriculture, Drought and Emergency Management.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Thank the member for her question. Australia over the last 2 years has faced fire, flood and drought. Deloitte Access Economics estimates that currently it costs the economy around $18.2 billion, natural disasters to our economy, and by 2050 it will be around $39 billion. So building that resilience within our communities is so important, and it's quite poignant today, Mr Speaker, that in your gallery is the Mayor of Longreach Regional Council at the forefront of the drought. And he has led the way in building resilience in his local community in Western Queensland, and I acknowledge him for that, and those local government leaders that have done that. But that's why the government has rolled out a range of programs across all those natural disasters. Over $10 billion committed to the drought in ensuring that we equip our farmers with the tools to be able to be prepared, be more resilient for these droughts. $86 million going into innovation hubs, 8 of them around the country, to get cutting-edge science, give our farmers the tools to equip them for a changing climate and be able to adapt and continue to add to our agricultural productivity. Well, the localised climate guides that the Bureau of Meteorology has put in, $2.7 million, that will give farmers real-time data to make real-time decisions. It's important for them in terms of being resilient through droughts. We haven't forgotten cyclones and floods. $10 million of the Queensland Household Resilience Program, and that's helping households renovate their homes to be prepared for cyclones in the future. And in fact, it's reducing insurance premiums by potentially up to $320 a year. Mitigation work for monsoons to make sure that they're prepared for flooding to protect them and their homes and livelihoods. Obviously, the Bushfire Royal Commission into natural disasters focused primarily on the bushfires has been handed down. The Prime Minister is taking our response to the National Cabinet because this has to be a coordinated approach. This isn't just the federal government. We have to work hand in hand with the states to make sure that this response is targeted and has the results that we ask for. And we haven't necessarily been sitting idle on this. The federal government has put $88 million into research to give the cutting-edge science into understanding the risk of bushfires into the future, but also equipping our firefighters with the practical techniques to be able to protect them and ourselves. Also, with respect to working with the states, we're trying to engage around hazard reduction and engaging our first Australians, the thousands of years of knowledge that they have, bringing that with the cutting-edge science to protect all Australians. That's the smart to the 21st century, bringing back the culture that should be acknowledged and understood. But we're also not forgetting the most important asset in all this, our people. Through all those disasters, the federal government has committed $132 million to mental health programs. Of that, $84 million has gone out the door, building the resilience in our most precious asset, our people, making sure they're prepared for the future.
The Prime Minister.
Questions be placed on those papers.
I thank the Prime Minister. The Leader